On your knees.
Okay, chop it off.
Chop it off. Let's do it. Oh, we got him now! You know what? I'm thinking they're probably sharper stairs somewhere else.
I'm AP Townley, and this is Roleplay Culture. And today, we're going to review the movie Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. We've seen the movie. We've come here as quickly as we can to report to you. With no script, we're going freeform today. So here we go. And obviously, it makes sense that this is a spoiler video, and we'll try and keep it on the down low as much as possible. But spoilers will be ahead. So this movie is directed by John Francis Daley and Jonathan Goldstein. It stars Chris Pine, Michelle Rodriguez, Sophia Lillis, Rege-Jean, Justice Smith, Daisy Head, and Chloe Coleman, and Hugh Grant. So it takes place in the Forgotten Realms campaign setting. Now, what a campaign setting is in Dungeons & Dragons is it's like a pre-made world. That way, when you're playing a game, a dungeon master doesn't have to come up with all the gods and the maps and all that stuff. He can just buy a book, has it all there for him, and he can just run with it. This campaign setting was created by Ed Greenwood in 1967, although he didn't publish anything until 1987. It includes the world, which is known as Toril. It includes a region in the world, which is where a lot of the story takes place, called Faerun, which is a little bit like Middle Earth or Europe. And a part of the Faerun is called the Sword Coast. It's the western coast and the north. And again, that's where a great deal of the story from this takes place, from the movie. So our story starts out in a prison, Revel's End. Now, what's interesting about this prison is it's almost brand new. It was created by the development team at Dungeons & Dragons and the development team for the film. They got together and made a location that would appear both in a D&D product and the movie, not quite simultaneously, but together. And that is this prison. The campaign setting is going to be Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frost Maiden, which is an adventure module. And of course, it also appears in the film. Our story starts off with our two heroes, Edgin the Bard, played by Chris Pine, and Holga the Barbarian, played by Michelle Rodriguez. And they escape from this prison, and they move through the story. And we meet our other characters. We meet Simon the Sorcerer, played by Justice Smith. What's interesting about him is he is a descendant from Elminster. If you're a D&D fan, you know who that is. And if you're not, let me tell you. Elminster is kind of like Gandalf for the Forgotten Realms. And everyone knows he is. He's a huge, powerful, very popular archmage. And Simon is his descendant. And that family pressure is a big part of his character. He has zero confidence, and a lot of his magic fails. And his growth through the story is him gaining more confidence about his heritage and being able to perform his magic properly. We also meet Doric, the Tiefling Druid. And those are two words that don't usually go together. Tieflings are devil-blooded. Or sometimes, in the books, they're sometimes referred to as demon-blooded. She has horns and a tail, and little pointy ears. And she's a druid, and in the film, she turns into an owlbear. So she's probably the most controversial character that's been created for Dungeons & Dragons in a while. Simply because the rules don't support that. But who cares? Fun trumps rules, right? So, our characters move along to Neverwinter, which is a very popular, well-known city on the Sword Coast. And before all this, we see a flashback where the characters reveal how they were captured from their latest heist. And the crew, which includes the sorcerer, the Bard, the Barbarian, and a new character that we made a little later, Forge the Rogue, along with a wizard named Sophia, who is not part of the core group. They raid a Harper's Nest for magical items. Harpers are one of the big organizations through Forgotten Realms. They are mostly made up of wizards and bards, and they're kind of an independent spy organization fighting against evil and the like. And Edgin, who was formerly a Harper, is able to break into this place, and he's looking for the Tablets of Awakening, which is a new magic item as far as I can tell. It doesn't exist in the books, which is kind of cool. His goal is to resurrect his wife. His story is that he had a family when he was a Harper. He had a wife and a young daughter, and a mistake led his enemies, Thayans, to his doorstep where they murdered his wife. But she hid their daughter, so she survived. Well, now he sees an opportunity to resurrect his wife and finally give his daughter the mother that he thinks she deserves. But unfortunately, the plan goes awry. The wizard is much more aggressive than expected and starts attacking the guards and casts a time stop spell, which stops everything in its tracks. And unfortunately, that includes him and Michelle. Michelle's character, Holga. And that's how they get captured. So, fast forward 2 years, and this is important. This fast forward, this 2-year gap, is actually where one of the books takes place. Yes, there are 3 prequel books, 2 novels and a graphic novel, that lead up and help flesh out the characters a little more. This particular book, The Druid's Call by E.K. Johnston, really fleshes out Doric, the Druid's character. So a lot of her story that's taking place is actually taking place in this 2-year gap. So it might be important to know that. So we move on, and the characters go to Neverwinter looking for Edgin's daughter. And they're also looking for Forge the Rogue, because Forge can promise to take care of her. And they find them, and that's where things go wrong even more. It turns out that Forge is in league with the wizard Sophia, and he has become Lord of Neverwinter, and has betrayed the party. So at this point, they must run. At this point, Holga picks up a nice shiny axe, a dark steel axe from Gelrin Foehammer. Gelrin Foehammer might be a name that some D&D fans might know. He appears in the Storm King's Thunder adventure module in the town of Tribor. He is an NPC that you can actually pick up and help you for a little bit of time. They escape. They go and pick up Simon, who lets them know that he knows a druid that might be able to help them infiltrate the palace again. And this druid is Doric. And one of the funny interactions between Simon and Doric in here and in the book is that he is subtly courting her, but she's not very used to human interaction and doesn't realize it. She doesn't even remember him. They run across each other several times. So the heroes get together a plan. They realize they need to get a special magical helmet, the Helmet of Disjunction. And for that, they need the Paladin, Zinc, who is played by Rege-Jean. And for this, they must go into the Underdark. The Underdark is a vast labyrinth underneath Toril, full of caves and many, many dangers. The interaction between the party and the Paladin is very interesting. I believe that we have 2 gameplay styles that they're being tried to represent on the films. And those gameplay styles are, with the Bards group, you have what I would call a typical D&D game, where it's a bunch of idiots running around trying to solve problems and usually screwing up and making lots of jokes. And then we have the Paladin in what he represents, heroic fantasy. Much more serious, no jokes, everything is straight on the line. And when these 2 things clash, it's quite funny. So they go to the Underdark to find the MacGuffin, and we see more shenanigans. There's a scene where it's in the trailers where Simon the Sorcerer accidentally triggers a trap and destroys their way across. Now, I imagine this was representation of a certain kind of incident that can happen with Dungeon Masters, where a player does something stupid and destroys the means for the plot to continue. And the DM has to sit there, scratch his head, and go, how can I get these idiots along? Ah, I know. They got this stupid stick they picked up. Sorcerer, roll a check. Good, you succeeded. I rolled a 2. No, you succeeded. And it's a staff that does this thing that gets you across. In this case, it's the hither-thither staff, which is another new magic item. It's pretty cool. So they get the MacGuffin, and the story moves along. And we find out a little later that the wizard, Sophia, is actually a red wizard of Thay. The red wizards of Thay come from, obviously, Thay. Thay is a country far to the east in Toril. They are a magocracy, usually quite evil. They are ruled by mages, the Zolkirs, which they were often referred to as red mages because they wear red, and they have tattoos on their head. And quite a few of them, especially now, which is revealed in the story, are undead. The implication is that they are liches, but that is not said. So, to wrap it up, the characters go through many hijinks. I don't want to ruin the ending. Simon finally finds his competence. There are some interesting game mechanics that are represented in the film. Concentration, for one. Typically, you need for a sorcerer to maintain concentration on certain spells. If they take damage, they have to make a check to see if they lose that concentration. There's an incident where a wizard is concentrating on a spell, and it's a nasty one, and Doric uses her trusty little slingshot to peg her in the head with something, and she loses concentration. There's another long-running incident, which is very interesting, that involves attunement. Certain powerful magical items in 5th edition require you to attune to them. This just requires a rest in the game. There's no check or anything you have to make. But in the film, it's a much more of a big deal, much more of a trial for Simon to have to attune to this helmet. And it was very interesting to see that represented. During a labyrinth phase, where the characters are all running around, we see a lot of interesting aha moments. The 1980s Dungeons & Dragons cartoon, the party that is represented there shows up several times in this movie. You can see the little barbarian with the horns running around with his group. And that was very interesting. That was very entertaining. We see several magical beasts. We see a displacer beast, which is basically a giant black panther that has tentacles with barbs. I imagine if you look at a lake and you see a fish swimming in it, and you go to hit that fish, the light displaces the fish. So where you put your hand, you won't hit it. That's kind of how a displacer beast works. You try to hit them, and they're not there. They're somewhere else. So they're very difficult to hit. In the film, the way they represent that, it's very interesting. It's almost like an illusion that they're casting from their barbed tentacles, which I quite liked. We, of course, have a gelatinous cube. It's a big cube of ooze that dissolves you when you go into it. Doesn't look very threatening, but yeah, it's nasty. We also have a dragon in the Underdark. They run into the dragon Themberchaud. Themberchaud is very interesting. He appears in the Out of the Abyss adventure module. He is the wormsmith of Gracklstugh. Gracklstugh in the Underdark is the capital for the Duergar, which are gray dwarves. They're evil dwarves that live deep, deep under the earth. He is the one that lights their forges for him. But now, because of the events of the film, he is much more robust than he usually is, and he's not there anymore. It kind of makes you wonder what happened to the city. Also in the Underdark, we see the Intellect Devourer, which is basically a giant brain on legs. It's really terrifying. It's a small part, though. We also have Axebeaks, which are kind of like nastier ostriches. We have many spells. Simon casts a reverse gravity spell, which basically picks everyone and puts them on the roof. We have animate objects, the shield spell, glow of invulnerability. There's an awesome scene with Bigby's hand, famous hand, that Scanlan from Vox Machina uses. It's basically two hands that fight each other with the evil wizard. We have plenty of magic items. As was said before, we have the Helmet of Disjunction and the Hither-Thither staff. We have a cleric token that can have Speak with Dead and the Tablet of Awakening. Some criticisms I might have with this movie. Well, neither the Druid or the Bard cast magic, which in 5th edition is pretty traditional. But I don't think this is a problem. I've waffled on whether I like that or not. But I think it makes sense. The movie seems to focus very heavily on what the class is really, really good at. For the Bard, it's inspiration. Edgin is very inspiring to Simon and the others to get them to go beyond their self-interest and their fears. Doric also doesn't seem to be casting magic. Instead, she wild shapes. She wild shapes much more than she would normally be able to in the game, and into things that you wouldn't normally be able to wild shape into, such as an owlbear, which is very interesting. Holga the Barbarian kicks a lot of butt, and I think that's basically what a barbarian does. Simon the Sorcerer, very interesting how he does spells. They represent material components very well. He has this interesting little spinning device on his belt where they come out when he needs them. He does the verbal components, very cool as well. And most importantly, when he does the somatic components, that's the hand gestures, he apparently drew on his knowledge of American Sign Language. So some of the things he does actually say the words that he's saying in sign language, which is fascinating, really. I think it's a lot of effort you put into the part. I've heard some say there's some of the emotional moments in the movie don't quite hit home because the characters aren't well developed. There's a video by D&D Shorts, I'll put a link in the description below, where he talks about that. What's interesting is he also mentions when he saw the movie there was someone further down the line who was crying, just crying rivers of tears. And I would be willing to bet that that person read the prequel novels, which do a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to further fleshing out the characters. Doric is probably the most egregious example. She's probably developed the least in the movie, but she has her own book, The Druid's Call. There's also the Road to Neverwinter book by J. Johnson, which shows how all the characters get together. They really flesh out Holga and Edgin's relationship, of how they ended up taking care of this little girl for years, even though they're not related in any way. How they meet the rogue, how they meet the sorcerer, their first real big adventure together, how they meet Sophia. That's very interesting. She's the major villain in the movie, and she's in this book. So I definitely recommend reading those books if you can. There's one more novel. It's not a novel. It's a graphic novel. The Feast of the Moon by Jeremy Lambert. We see a little more of Kira, played by Chloe Coleman, and her relationship with the rogue and how they start to bond a little bit. It makes a little more sense why she's willing to abandon her father for him, which is what happens in the movie. But I promise there were no tears on my part. Oh no. That was definitely my allergies. Absolutely had something in my eye. No crying here. So that's it for today. Hope you subscribe. Hope you smash the like button. Put a comment below. Tell me if you've seen it, if you're going to see it. And I'll see you in the parlor.